Alright, students, I'm going to give you an overview and review of the Reconstruction period, particularly the policies and problems and why Reconstruction came to an end. And this will help you when you take your quiz on Thursday on Reconstruction. And this will be loaded up to Edpuzzle with questions embedded. So I'm going to go over the content again so you can refresh your memory. We already know what Reconstruction is, or we actually know what Reconstruction was. It was a time period after the Civil War where the 11 Confederate states were readmitted back into the Union. And it was a long, drawn-out process that the South had to go through, the whole country had to go through to make sure our country was whole again. Okay, I'm going over these policies and problems real quick and elaborate on some of them. First one says that Southern military leaders could not hold office. What that basically meant was that the Southern military leaders couldn't serve in the Congress. They couldn't be a senator. They couldn't be a congressman. They had difficulty serving in the state Southern legislatures. But they could not hold office at the federal level where they could make laws, because the Republicans in Congress, particularly people in the North, they did not trust the Southern military leaders if they were to hold office, because they believed that they would not be loyal to the Union, that they would not protect the rights of African Americans after they had been slaves, and that they would not follow the Reconstruction policies properly. So basically, they took power away from Andrew Johnson, who was the president of the United States at the beginning of Reconstruction. And he was more sympathetic to the South. He didn't believe African Americans should be given any equal rights, any equal protection under the law. And he was a former slave owner himself. So that's a point to mention. African Americans could hold public office for the first time. People like Hiram Revels became the first senator from the South, I think from Louisiana or Mississippi. So African Americans hold public office, senators, governors, mayors, so they could serve in the government and make policy and enforce the law. African Americans gained equal rights as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And in order for African Americans to have these equal rights, federal troops were needed to enforce it, to make sure it was carried out. And federal troops were stationed in the South to make sure law and order was done, make sure African Americans weren't mistreated, make sure they're treated equally under the law, serving on juries, allowed to vote, allowed to own property, anything that comes with the right of being a citizen. Because the word civil rights means rights given to you as a citizen. We have freedoms, basic freedoms. Northern soldiers supervised the South because of the Reconstruction Acts. And we learned that they did this because they had to maintain order and then to enforce laws, enforce freedoms African Americans had gained. Okay, and supervise means to watch over it and control. And they supervised over the 5 military districts. They had the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established by Abraham Lincoln to aid former enslaved African Americans in the South. They provide food, shelter, and clothing. They set up schools, universities. They supervised labor contracts. They basically provided assistance so African Americans could adapt and adjust to their new life of freedom. And many people aren't going to like that. So the Freedmen's Bureau was very important. Southerners resented carpetbaggers who took advantage of the South during Reconstruction. And carpetbaggers were people from the North who came down South. They carried their belongings in a carpet bag. They tried to help improve the Southern economy. They started up businesses. They started railroad companies, bought land, bought property that a lot of Southerners lost during the war. and they were looked down upon by Southerners, and that term is still used today for anybody who comes from the north down to the south to live. You're called a carpetbagger. Another thing about Reconstruction policies is that Southern states adopted black codes to limit the economic and physical freedom of former slaves. If you were black, you had to prove that you had a job. If not, you went to jail. You had a curfew you had to follow, which means you had to be at home at a certain time. You couldn't own a gun. You couldn't travel. Couldn't rent property. You basically were like a slave, but you were free physically, but you're treated like a slave. A lot of blacks went into sharecropping, which is basically another way of slavery. Long story about that. Here's a picture of, well, actually it's a portrait of the Civil Rights Act being passed in 1866. You see some African American people in this picture. Quick review of the 3 amendments. They're basically the civil rights amendments for African Americans. The 13th Amendment banned slavery in the United States and all its territories. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship and equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to all men regardless of color. And they didn't mean anything because they were pretty much undermined. And I'm going to tell you why later on. Here's some illustrations to keep in mind. This picture on the left is a freedmen's school set up by the Freedmen's Bureau. Some women are being educated. Some are learning skills, learning trade, in order to adapt and adjust to freedom. Set up by Abraham Lincoln. This picture right here, this cartoon is a carpetbagger. He has a little carpetbagger bag says South on it. It's got a stovetop hat. Looks like Abraham Lincoln. So I guess that's what they associate it with, particularly the cartoonist. This guy's got some weird looking eyes, like Halloween, like frightful, spooky. And here's a picture of a map. This is a map of the South during Reconstruction. The green states are the Confederate states. And the black boldface years on each of the states in the Confederacy is the year when they were readmitted back into the Union. Finally came back into the Union. And the South is divided up into 5 military districts because of the Reconstruction Acts. You learned about 3 important men during Reconstruction. You had to make a photo gallery on these 3 individuals. The word legacy is something that you leave behind so people can remember you by, something that's special, something that's noteworthy. You leave a name for yourself. You got Abraham Lincoln, 16th president during the Civil War, in the first part of Reconstruction. His Reconstruction plan called for reconciliation. His big thing was to make sure the South was reunited back with the Union after the Civil War. Another big deal about him was the preservation of the Union was more important than punishing the South. Preservation means to keep, maintain. You have Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. He fought for the adoption of constitutional amendments that guaranteed voting rights. He worked with Abraham Lincoln about issues about African Americans. He encouraged African American men to be enlisted into the Union Army. And Douglass was a powerful voice for human rights and civil liberties for all. So like I said earlier, I think one time in class, that he was for women's rights is all. He also was an ambassador, which means you're a representative, you represent a country abroad. So he traveled a lot, talk about why slavery was wrong. Then you have Robert E. Lee, the great Virginian. He was the general of the Army of Northern Virginia. He urged Southerners to reconcile with Northerners at the end of the war and reunite as Americans when someone to continue to fight. There was a lot of bitterness among Southerners of losing the war and coming back into the Union. So he told them to brush that off and move on. He later became president of Washington College, which is now known as Washington and Lee University. So both Lincoln and Lee pushed for reconciliation. Reconciliation means that you come back together after you've had an argument or fight. You improve your relationship with somebody. You brush it off. You move on. You repair any ill feelings that you had between somebody. So reconciliation means to come back together after you've had an argument or fight. And Reconstruction came to an end, and it came to an end in 1877. This gentleman in the right-hand corner is Rutherford B. Hayes. And the three reasons that resulted or reasons why Reconstruction came to an end. It was a negative consequence for African Americans. Reconstruction ended in 1877 as a result of a compromise over the outcome of the election of 1877. So there was no clear winner in that election. So Rutherford B. Hayes made a deal with some of the Democrats in Congress to get them to vote for him. And he said basically number 2 right here, federal troops were removed from the South. And we learned that federal troops were needed in the South to help maintain order, to help rebuild the South, and also to protect African Americans in the South, make sure their freedoms were upheld, make sure that they were taken care of. And that was a negativity because the federal troops were taken out. It's like you remove cops from a community or area where there's a lot of violence. When the violence goes down, that's good because the cops are there. When the cops are gone, the violence picks up. So federal troops were needed in the South in order to protect African Americans and make sure the South would reconstruct properly. And when they were moved, not a good outcome if you're African American. So number 3, along with that, rights that African Americans had gained were lost through Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws basically segregated whites and blacks. Basically, it was a system that segregated people based on race. And it was not a good system because people were discriminated against. People were treated unfairly. People were not treated like citizens of the United States. Very hard for African Americans. And this problem was corrected almost 100 years later in dealing with it because of the Civil Rights, by way of the Civil Rights Act and Civil Rights Movement. We'll talk more about Jim Crow laws later. This is a diagram that shows the efforts to gain black equality during the 19th century. And you have first, then, next, and following Reconstruction. And it says use the text box below to place the events correctly in the boxes. You may just place the number. I went on ahead and did that for you. This is also in your packet. First, slavery is practiced in the South on plantations. That was done for like 250 years of chattel slavery. Not all African Americans were slaves, by the way, but a vast majority of them were. You had free slaves, and you had free African Americans in the South. You had free African Americans in the North, but a vast majority of African Americans were slaves. Then after that, this box right here says then, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Slavery is no more. And then next, it says black codes adopted by southern states to limit economic and physical freedom of former slaves. So this box right here was a reaction of the 13th Amendment. You get groups like the Ku Klux Klan rise about. Then the last says following Reconstruction, which means after Reconstruction, rights blacks had gained were lost through Jim Crow laws. The right to vote, right to be treated equally under the law. And that's it. Take your quiz and put a smile on my face by getting a good grade.